All right, what I kind of envisioned here was sort of a free-flowing format here to kind of wrap things up. We'll do this for a little bit, ask for some audience engagement as well, and then we've got a few books we're going to give away. We'll figure out. I didn't really plan out how that's going to go, but we'll figure something out there. So that's right, thinking on the fly, just like Cooper apparently.
Scrum.
Improvise. There you go. So. I guess I'll just kind of, we'll just call this a panel discussion, and if the audience has questions, feel free to raise your hand and get involved. But I guess the first question I'll ask, and I'll direct this at Bruce because you've got the microphone there, and that is, do you think the real D.B. Cooper will be discovered? Do you think that this case will ever be resolved?
Short answer is yes. I believe that we'll find D.B. Cooper. I believe the kind of tenacity, mental gymnastics, integrity that Tom Kay has demonstrated and described today in his research, that kind of stuff, brought across the whole D.B. Cooper community. Advances in forensic, the tools, building our toolbox, our forensic toolbox. We'll find who D.B. Cooper is. And to that end, people have been asking me, who do I think D.B. Cooper is? I'm going to say, when we find out who D.B. Cooper is, we're going to go, who the hell is that? And imagine everybody in this room going, having to be reconvinced, like re-educated. It'd be like a Vietnamese re-education program, you know. And you really believed in your suspect, but he's really not D.B. Cooper, you know.
After 47 years, why haven't we shut the case, closed the door unequivocally? I don't know if anybody can speak to it. I mean, again, because it seems to me that the prevailing thought, and I think Tom, you mentioned it as well, is that eventually we'll know who D.B. Cooper was, which implies that something's going to happen in the next X number of years that didn't happen in the last 47, and presumably it's getting a little bit more difficult just because time is passing by and people are dying and firsthand accounts are going with them and so forth. So having said all that, for those of you who think that it's likely that D.B. Cooper will eventually, the mystery will be solved, how exactly do you see that unfolding, given it's been 47 years?
The reason why Larry Carr reached out to the public and released the information to the public is his boss told him that we're not going to spend any time or money on the D.B. Cooper case. Now, if you think about it, that's actually the correct answer. As the public who funds the FBI here, we don't want them wasting their time on a 40-year-old case from a guy that's probably already dead, right? There's much, much better things for the FBI to do. So if you extrapolate that backwards, since 1980 when they found the money, I'm sure there's a little bit of activity during the 1980s, but since then, this thing has been not even on the back burner. This has been locked in a file and nobody wanted to be involved. It wasn't until Larry Carr came along and said, I love this case personally, I want to get involved, that this whole thing came here. So had we not been here to talk about it, had Larry not released the information, this would be a dead issue. We'd only know him from songs and the movie. So the information that was released by Larry that got the ball rolling has now been taken up with the FOIA requests, which are releasing a lot of this 302 information. I think, and the number of brains that are working on it, and you saw what happened here today. People get up in front of everyone, we say a bunch of things, and out of the audience comes these little gems. Did you think about this, or did you look at that? And this is all building a foundation in which we can eventually, I think, solve the case. Now, as I said in my talk, there's somebody knows something. This didn't happen in a complete vacuum. Somebody knows something. Somebody's not saying anything. And when Cooper finally dies, that's when I think we will potentially solve the case. So I've got to agree with Bruce here that I think we're actually probably in the golden age or the golden moment here in the next years to solve the case. And I think it's definitely doable.
Well, if those of you who heard me speak, I believe that we did just that. And I think Walter actually meets the profile that you established, Tom, that he was out of the blue. No one thought he would do it, that he'd die. But I understand your skepticism, I do. But I'm just saying, I think it would be really hard for the Cooper vortex to accept Cooper at any point. I mean, we've almost established the same thing as the FBI, which is a ridiculous standard to come up with the $20 bill or the parachute. Well, the parachute's probably, if it hasn't been found now, it's really disintegrated, or we know that in the Washington State area that people used it to cover their woods if they found a parachute and they used it around the house for toys or whatever. So I think it would be really hard because so many people have invested so much time in this that I just think it would be really hard for universally everyone to say, yes, he was. We have one more holdout. We had Walter's son actually reached out to us and said he left a message saying he had some very valuable information for us for the story, and which that's about the only thing that we would reopen if something like that happened. But that would be interesting because he spent a lot of time with Walter even when he was overseas. So, and then he just wouldn't answer his phone or anything. So he decided to withdraw. So we're hoping that he does come forward. But like I said, I just really think it would be hard for the Vortex to accept and universally accept. And the FBI, just like you said, they have no desire to solve this. They're not going to do it. So I think it would be, I'd be really skeptical that it would happen.
I think that the likelihood that the mystery is solved is probably quite remote. And this is coming from somebody who feels pretty strongly about, the person, Sheridan Peterson, that, as I mentioned earlier. And part of the reason I felt the need to really move quickly and issue my report in the form of a report is because I was hoping to apply some pressure to Sheridan and see if, while he's still alive, if indeed he is D.B. Cooper, that the truth comes out. That said, I just think that so much time has passed that it strikes me as, I don't know how to handicap it, maybe 20% chance, something like that, that it'll actually end up being unequivocally solved. The smoking gun, so to speak. So that's my opinion with respect to that. But let me start with Bruce again, and maybe we could pass the microphone down again. And if anybody has any questions or input, feel free to engage. But I did want to ask about, here it is 47 years later to the day. Obviously, there's a significant amount of fascination with the case. I can just see from the website that was set up for this event, dbcoopercon.com, thousands of individuals from all over the world have gone to that site within the last 2 weeks to check it out. Thousands from all over the world, every corner of the world. So it's obvious to me that there's a significant appetite, a significant interest on the part of D.B. Cooper. What does that say? What does that say about the human condition, or just people in general, society, what have you? Why is it that people are still fascinated with this case 47 years down the road?
Why are we not only still fascinated, but becoming more fascinated? As we speak, there are 3 documentaries on D.B. Cooper that I'm aware of that are being filmed, and probably more. The Travel Channel is filming 2 with 2 different production companies, it's my understanding, plus Minnow Films out of London for the BBC is doing a 4-hour thing. So that's going to be a lot of exposure. And when you look at the zeitgeist of our times, I think it's fair to characterize this as we live in the era of fake news. Whatever that means to you, and whatever it means politically, and whatever it means to the people who say, well, that's fake news or that's fake news, I think there is a growing hunger, at least unconsciously, and certainly to some degree consciously, and guys like me who are investigative reporters, we want truth. We want to tell true stories. We want to know what happened, who did what. And I think it speaks to a deep longing in the soul. Some of us here that have been talking about just storytelling in general, and this kind of phenomena, this sociological phenomena, I think is best represented when you look at Moth Stories and NPR radio and podcasts, the explosion of podcasts of people telling stories that are personal, It happened to me. I know what I'm talking about. It's authentic and it's transformative, and I really want to tell you about it because I think you're really going to enjoy that story. So this kind of dynamic, I think, is just, it's part of a huge tidal wave that I think the D.B. Cooper story is just being part of. Clearly the Cooper story has been a huge groundswell for 47 years. So there are other waves joining, you know. So call it a tsunami of storytelling.
Anybody have any questions? Okay, good.
I have an opinion on that. I really think that the reason the D.B. Cooper story resonates is because it's, you know, it was fascinating. Out of all of the hijackings between 68 and 72, 131 of them, only one was never solved. And so, I mean, they equated the story to the story of Robin Hood. And I keep saying, well, yeah, it's kind of like the Robin Hood story if you forget about the part where he gives back to the poor, okay? Because there was no money going to the poor after this crime. But there was really no damage. No one got hurt. No one died. I mean, there was some emotional problems to the stewardesses. I grant that. But the reality is, the only person hurt, or the only group hurt, was the insurance company that had to pay the money. And who cares about an insurance company, all right? So now it's kind of like, all right, yeah, great, it's one for the small guy. So I think that's kind of it more than the Robin Hood. It's just like, yeah, the little guy finally won, you know? And I think that is the allure, actually.
Well, and I'll say this, talking about the insurance company, they're out $180,000 because Northwest Orient had to pay $20,000 as a premium or what have you, deductible, that's what I'm looking for. They also got a significant portion of the bills. I will hazard a guess that they could sell the bills that they have, and I don't know where they are, for much more than $180,000. So actually, it's probably a hell of an investment on their part. Hey, Bruce, maybe they were behind it from the very beginning. I'll say this much. I'll get to you in a second, sir. I believe that part of the reason the public is fascinated with it is because it was just such a bold, audacious, and innovative crime that hearing about it, everybody just wants to see a picture. They just want to see the guy who actually did it. You know, if you heard about a news, you're like, this is an amazing story. I got to see the guy who did it and hear the story because it's just so amazing. However, in this case, we don't know who he is. We don't know his name. We don't know what he looks like. We don't know where he came from. There's so many things that we don't know, and it's just like just out of reach. But we still have that innate desire to see who the hell this guy was that pulled off this bold, innovative, and audacious skyjacking. So I think that that's just sort of built in to us as human beings to a large degree. The gentleman over there, you had a question or something you wanted to input.
Bruce was talking about the documentaries coming out this year, and I just noticed, I just had a question with all the cameras and everything filming this. Is this going to be released later on the Com website or elsewhere?
Yeah, that's my film crew that's doing the filming, and we're making the entire raw footage available to Eric. He sponsored this. By the way, we should all thank him for that. It was very, very generous. And so it'll be available, as well as all the presenters. We will give them the raw footage so that they can use that. But yeah, it would be nice. We thought it would be a really nice idea if we could actually condense this. It's going to be hard. We're going to need the help of the presenters to actually condense it because our document that we have is 3 hours long. It's 45-minute episodes. That's a long time to watch film. Now, if you're streaming or if you're, just going through it for the night, that's fine. But to do this all in 8 hours of footage is going to be really hard to sell. So yes, we would like to do it in a condensed version. We want to make sure that the presenters don't feel that we're trying to bias it, because it's really hard to condense. If you listen to each of the presenters, how do you condense? The editing would be just brutal, but there's a possibility. We're going to have the footage, and like I said, it's all about being fair to each presenter. So it's going to be a challenge. I have to say that.
Yeah, and obviously the 50th anniversary is coming up in 2021, the golden anniversary of the skyjacking. And I think that there's going to be a significant amount of interest built around that. I know, along with Bruce, I've received a handful of communique from production companies in LA and so forth, interested in Sheridan Peterson in particular as it pertains to the story, the D.B. Cooper story at large. But to switch subjects a little bit here, but basically I believe that the FBI really kind of messed this thing up in a number of ways. And one of the things that I've believed that in one area that they messed up was that they should have shown the tie on TV almost immediately. If they would have, from day one said, hey, this was left on the plane and here's the little tie bar that goes with it. That's a material, concrete piece of evidence. There may well have been something that says, yeah, that looks like, the tie that Bob wore to work, or maybe a family member or something like that. But by holding it back, in essentially relying upon a sketch, which by pretty much all the witnesses agree doesn't do a particularly good job at actually showing what D.B. Cooper actually looked like, it opened the door for a flood of suspects to come in, and you can imagine the logistical challenge. I mean, I've gone through the tens of thousands of pages or the thousands of pages, and the suspects are, it's just crazy, the number of suspects that the FBI had to vet, and they had to vet every single one. I'll just tell you 3 quick ones that I remember. I remember reading about a suspect. Somebody had contacted the FBI and they said that, hey, I was just watching an episode of Perry Mason and one of the secondary actors on the show looks just like D.B. Cooper. You need to check that guy out. I had another person contacted the FBI and said, I was at a bar and sitting next to a guy who paid his bar bill and he opened his wallet up and he had a lot of cash in there. And then there was another person, the third person that I remember as I was reading through the files, that talked about, he contacted the FBI and he said he had created this divining device that would help locate the money, which was basically a bottle of water with a wire and Alka-Seltzer. The thing is that it sounds ridiculous, but the FBI, when somebody like that approaches them, has to take it seriously. In other words, they maybe this guy's Cooper and he's just a little bit off his rocker and he's, trying to present it as he's got some special powers. So prefacing it in that way, do you think the FBI messed up and or not? And could this case have been solved within a year of it happening, or not?
Well, I believe I'm not sure there were mistakes made. I think there may have been diversion. Of course, I'm working with Joe Koenig, our investigator, and he teaches at the FBI, and so he tends to think, well, wait a minute, they didn't really mess up, But something that was pointed out to us as we were going through it is that, this happened on, the Thanksgiving Eve, and I happen to believe that like the best and the brightest of the FBI weren't on duty that night because they had enough seniority, to actually to not be working that day. And but it was a difficult case. There was I think a lot of misleading information, either knowingly or unknowingly disseminated, that made it immediately difficult. Yeah.
So I'll give a contrary opinion to that. I think the FBI did actually a pretty good job. Yeah. And I say that from the context, if you see the breadth of the investigation they did, the number of files that contain personal information about the suspects they investigated. Larry Carr said is about 10 feet long and about 8 feet tall. Now think about how many people that is that they have a dossier on, that they spent time on. Now given the breadth of that investigation, given the fact that they put 1,000 National Guard out there looking for Cooper's body, they found other people's bodies, they didn't find Cooper's body. They sent the SR-71 Blackbird to photograph the whole flight path. I mean, this is a huge effort. And from the width of that effort, you can cherry pick a bunch of things out of there and they said, oh, they screwed up here, or they missed this, or they overlooked this guy. Certainly that's going to be the case. And our big complaint was, in every situation where they did an investigation and nothing came out of it, they didn't document the fact that they did it. So there's a ton of stuff that they did that you never see because nothing positive came out of it. And we know this because when we did the money analysis, there was a black bill that we spent a lot of time analyzing, turned out to have silver out of the bill. We investigated how this could have come out of the river water, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, we proved that it was fingerprint solution. It was silver nitrate that they used for fingerprinting back in the day. They had tried to fingerprint the bill. It didn't work out. They turned the bill black, and they didn't say a thing about it in any of the 302s. So yeah, that was a screw up on their part. You know, should they have been clean? In the scientific world, that would have been a big no-no to spend all this time on it and get a negative result and not document it. But this is the way the FBI works. So from the breadth of the organization and the effort that they put forward on this thing, I think if they screwed up a few times, I'm willing to give that to them. Question back?
If they didn't screw up, then what led them to believe that D.B. Cooper landed in Ariel, Washington, when he got out of the plane, the Northwest plane, got out of the plane, and there were gorge winds blowing that night for a storm. That would have blown him into St. John's, which makes sense because the money was found in Tina Bar. That would be just over the river from St. John's, Oregon. So the question is why did they look in Ariel when he could have landed in St. John's, Oregon?
I'm not familiar with where St. John's is. I know the winds were from the southwest that night.
They're from the southwest, they were blowing from the gorge.
Well, the way we understand it, I think is winds were southwest, right?
The winds were from the southwest over the primary landing zone. Landing zone, by the way, Clyde, right? Clyde Lewis? Yes, welcome. Clyde Lewis is the host and the voice of Ground Zero radio, and has done a number of D.B. Cooper shows, and I've had the honor of being on one of his shows along with Galen Cook and examining the gossip, Wolfies, yeah. So, the winds from the gorge I've never seen any evidence that the winds from the gorge had any effect on D.B. Cooper's landing. People who are familiar with the gorge know the winds are hellacious at times. And that night, the winds were unbelievable. And there's a guy who has been at other D.B. Cooper conferences and has spoken quite a bit about it, Meyer Louie, has talked about that he was driving through the gorge that night and was afraid for his life. He thought the car was going to be blown off I-85 and into the river. So those are very real dynamics. The question is, to what degree did that affect D.B. Cooper landing? And I've not seen any compelling evidence that would suggest that it was.
It's just a theory.
It's a theory.
I don't know what I did or what I was doing. I was with a crew. I think it was during the TOSA investigation when they were dragging the river again and they found some stuff and it really wasn't anything. I think we found a parachute, but it wasn't D.B. Cooper's.
They found a pilot chute.
Yeah, they found a pilot chute.
Yeah.
And
Which is is 3 or 4 feet.
right.
in
And we were
diameter.
talking, the reason why and I was curious as to why they were dragging the river there because of the whole aerial thing. And I'm thinking, well, the whole aerial thing doesn't make sense to me then if they were over Tina's Bar and then they said, well, we found the money there. And I'm thinking, okay, that makes sense. But then that would kind of indicate that if that was the case, then maybe he got caught up when he fell out of the plane, when he dropped out of the plane, got caught up in maybe some gorge winds that blew him off course from Ariel. And, as it was going over Battleground. Did he jump over Battleground? I think I heard.
That's the prevailing view, that he jumped, that the plane was over Battleground when he jumped out and he blew back towards Seattle because the winds were coming from the southwest, which would put him in that Amboy, Ariel area, La Conner maybe, because the Rackshore people have been looking in La Conner. Yeah.
I have a discrepancy with it. That's the only thing I have, because I'm trying to figure that would only make sense as to the reason why the Tina Bar money was found there, because that would mean that, because I know that the river was different, that was going through the area differently at the time, because I was told that when I was in the investigation there, and I thought, well, maybe he just landed somewhere closer to St. John's and not anywhere near.
The problem with the Tina Bar money is you can't figure that into anything about the Cooper world. All of us that looked at the Tina Bar money, nobody's got a good way to put the money on Tina Bar that connects to the flight path. So if you're going to...
I know it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Right.
I don't think anybody can give a good answer to that.
But people have tried. The Travel Channel and Robert Nicholson filmed an episode at Tina Bar where he provided an alternative theory that for about 40 miles or so, the flight went west, deviated out of Victor 23 air corridor, and was flying down the north reach of the Columbia, where it goes past Kelso and Longview and comes down to Tina Bar. And Robert said, if you accept a deviated flight path, it would be at Tina Bar at 8:12 p.m. And that's just about the time that most people are saying that's when Cooper left the plane because of all the oscillation and the bumps and things like that.
I just want to make one more comment. I am so glad, I mean, I'm late to this, by the way, but I'm so glad
You are.
guys are doing this, because I've been to every DB Cooper gathering, and there's never been an opportunity to discuss technicalities like this. And I'm very glad that I'm here right now.
You are.
Go
Yeah.
on.
This was good. This was a good day.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah,
Thank you so
yeah.
much.
And I hope that we have many more. Question?
Yeah, these 302s and 20,000 pages of stuff and the Freedom of Information stuff. Is there any place where normal people like I can access that? I may be way behind the curve on this question.
Yeah, there's a few places. Eric, you want to talk to that? Since you've read 20,000 friggin' pages.
The FBI itself has a website. They refer to it as the Vault, the FBI Vault. And in the FBI Vault, they have all those pages. There's actually 32 clumps of documents that they've released now. Each clump of documents is typically 450 pages or so, 400 to 500 pages. They're heavily redacted, very dry. I mean, I've seen many pages where the entire page is redacted, so it's a little bit frustrating at that. But yeah, anybody with an internet connection can go on there. And to swing back around to the flight path.
Can I just piggyback? Yeah. The best place to find stuff is to read the stuff that I stole from Jeffrey Gray. And all of his stuff, he's now re-released everything. He has 77 pages, and it's in another vault. It's in the DB Cooper Forum vault. So go to dbcooper.com, and you can see Jeffrey Gray's 77 pages that are not redacted. They have a lot of coffee stains on them, okay? Also, the DB Cooper Forum vault also has several hundred, if not thousands of pages of the 302s that are redacted. So that's where I go. So anyway.
I actually wanted to just swing back around to the flight path because Robert Nicholson, who you talked about in the Travel Channel, there's been a lot of discussion about the flight path and so forth. And what Robert essentially is saying is that in a critical point in the flight path, instead of the jet actually, I'm going to draw it as if you're looking at it properly. I'm looking at it the reverse way. The jet comes down and then kind of goes around like this. He jumps somewhere over here, swings back around, and then goes over Portland. Robert says that, no, he thinks the jet just went straight. He says it just went straight, even though the proper Victor 23 path would be more like that. So Robert's saying that doesn't make sense. It makes more sense that it would go straight. And he actually wrote a 23-page document, I guess is the best way to put it, that explains in great detail. And this guy's very well educated at aeronautical engineer and so forth. I've actually included in my report because I think he's right. I actually think he's right. I think the FBI is wrong about the flight path, SAGE notwithstanding and everything else. And it's just too much of a coincidence in my mind that if the plane just happened to fly south and at 8:12 p.m. just happened to be over Tina Bar, and lo and behold, the bundles are found at Tina Bar, that's just too much of a coincidence for him to just out of hand just kind of push aside and say, well, I don't believe that. I believe in something else. So let me just ask the audience here, how many of you have sort of a favorite suspect? And if you don't mind, I'm gonna. Okay, well, okay, but and we know, Mr. Yeah, well, let me see. Anybody else here? Anybody else have sort of a favorite suspect?
Gossett.
Okay, William Gossett. Okay, yes, ma'am.
I have no idea about the suspect, but I can tell you as an airline pilot that has flown Portland, Seattle for the commuter Horizon with my last airline, most of the time we go direct. You are supposed to fly an airway, but we always request to be faster to go direct, and it's just faster. And there is the Battleground VR that I've been out there with authors walking around, where you take a turn in the airway. Everybody in the airplane airplane knows where that battleground VOR is when the airplane turns. So whether they're going direct or whether they actually turned over that VOR and you know exactly where you are as a passenger, as a pilot, as whatever, over that turn, because it's where the airway ends. It's fascinating. If you were jumping, would you jump into the trees at night in a storm? No, you'd probably jump where it's clear, flat, no trees, and you'll survive. But I don't know who did it, and
I thought, if I'm not mistaken, I thought the airways deviated at Melee intersection a little further north. Would you know that, or the answer to
I
that?
was applying in 71.
I think it's the same.
There's a VOR at Battleground too.
But I mean, I think that's where, yeah, I understand that, but I think that's where Robert picks it up as Melee,
That's what Robin does.
because that's where it turns off there.
From Malay to Kansas, yeah.
So, yes, sir, you were saying your suspect, Gossett, okay. Yes, sir.
I was going to add about the flight path. I had given Bruce a name of the gentleman that
That's right, yeah.
that night to fly chase on that 7-2. And if you can find him, Lake Oswego, I think it goes.
Good, better, and different. I'll post something on the Mountain News and at the DB Cooper Forum.
So like I said, his email bounced. We emailed back and forth
Yeah.
for several years. But it would be nice if he could share. He would know he was dispatched out of the guard here. at
That's
the
right,
US.
that's right. He would know.
And they flew chase all the way down on that airplane.
So because we always have to have differing opinions in the board, we talked to the guy who did the air traffic control on Cooper coming off of Melee, handoff from Seattle to here. He was handling them all north of Portland. And at the end of the phone conversation I had with him, I said, "Is there anything that you can tell me that I haven't asked you a question about?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I can tell you for sure that he stuck straight on Victor 23 the whole time." All right, now this, we don't normally, I wouldn't put that in my website because we don't deal with contemporary information. We only deal with stuff that happened at the time. But since we're kicking things around here, this is the other side of the coin that says he was on that flight path. Our study of the stage radar showed that the plane was well within view of the stage radar the whole trip. So, there's a lot of stuff in the D.B. Cooper world. If something's over here, we need to move this over this way to make it fit. A lot of that happens in the D.B. Cooper world. Ideally, I think the final solution to the D.B. Cooper case, it'll be like putting together a puzzle. At first it starts very slow. You start at the corners, but once you get toward the end of that puzzle, the pieces start going together very quickly to fill in that central gap. So that's what we're looking for. I don't know if we're there yet or not.
Yes, Darren.
There's an obscure Canadian comic book about a daredevil pilot and skydiver, and the name of that comic book was Dan Cooper, and that comic predates the hijacking. Is that a coincidence?
And I think we all probably want to answer that.
I can take that because Carol.
Yeah, and I'll answer and we'll kind of pass along, and I know Tom will talk to that. To answer your question, I believe so. I believe it's just coincidence. Yeah, absolutely. It's also worth noting my suspect, Sheridan Peterson, goes by the name Pete. He's gone by the name Pete forever, as far as we know. Pete, obviously an abbreviation of Peterson. An abbreviation for the first name Sheridan, of course, is Dan. So is it possible that Dan Cooper, that partially explains where he came up with the name Dan Cooper, given that his first name was Sheridan?
Yeah, I think everybody, all the Cooper suspects have a Cooper in their history, and that's ours was Walter's was no different. He had a ongoing battle with a Cooper when he was in Detroit. It was just when he was with the Teamsters, and then later with the iron workers. So this was an ongoing battle. This guy tried to kill his son. So that was where we think the Cooper came from with Walter. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you a whole different shot here. Part of the transcripts say that he asked for negotiable American currency when he asked for the $200,000. Now, nobody in this room knows anybody that lives in this country that would ask for negotiable American currency. So your thought there is that he's probably not from this country, which would make sense. But the contrary opinion to that was he had no accent. So again, in the Cooper vortex here, we try and put these two things together and resolve them. We say, well, if you're not from this country and you have no accent, where could you possibly come from? And the answer from that is Canada. All right? So if he's from Canada, now we also have a comic book from Canada called Dan Cooper. And the Dan Cooper comic book represents the James Bond type character that we have here. Now, there's a lot of guys in this room that have looked in the mirror and said, Bond, James Bond, right? So could it be possible that Cooper, when he had the chance to be somebody else, picked a childhood favorite character from his Dan Cooper comic book and used that name to stand up and be brave in front of all kinds of adversity? Now, my teammate Carol Abrazinskis did a huge study on the Dan Cooper comic book, and she bought all the comic books that predated 1971. And she gave a talk at the last Cooper conference here about what she found. And she found all the aspects of the Cooper case in the Dan Cooper comic books, including the Seattle Needle, including jumping out of the airplane at night, and a guy jumping out of an airplane and under parachute in a suit, for God's sakes, right? Crazy, crazy stuff. A lot of this is on our website, citizensleuths.com. You can go check it out there. But it's interesting. This is how the Cooper thing works. So you put A and B together, and it follows with C, and then D kind of fits into it. Now, certainly we can find out something else down the road, but I can certainly put together a case that he was from Canada.
Did you want to talk about that, Bruce?
Just add in the French because the comic book is written in French. More mystery.
Let me just add something here. This is part of the problem with the case, is that there's a lot of contradictory information. Actually, the negotiable American currency, we're not really sure about that because there's other things that say it was actually circulated U.S. currency. So where the word negotiable came into the picture is somewhat up for discussion. It is not uncommon to read the FBI memos and see multiple memos contradicting themselves. One memo says one thing, one memo says another. One transcript says one thing says another. So that's part of the challenge here, is trying to figure out exactly what was stated and what happened. So, Mr. Collins, yes.
Thanks, Eric. The only question that kind of runs into my head is, if there goes back to that Vector 23, and I think she said that they generally try to fly straight instead of veering. If he jumped over the Columbia River at that time, at night, which may or may not have, the prevailing winds apparently went toward the northwest, heading toward the coast or the tip of the Olympic Peninsula. If he jumped over the Columbia River, wouldn't that, with the prevailing winds, put him right on Tina's Bar, or right nearby it?
Well, we've got two different directions here, because if they were heading toward to the northwest, then you're saying they were coming from the southeast, but you're saying, Bruce, that they came from the southwest. So.
Excuse me, no, that's not what I'm saying. If the jet is flying from Seattle directly to Portland, as Vector 23, or a straight shot, if the wind was then blowing this way, would not that have put him, if he jumped over the Columbia River, or in that vicinity, right about on Tina's Bar?
Well, let me ask you for clarification, which direction were you saying that the wind was blowing? You saying blowing toward the northwest?
Yeah, I have heard that the wind shifted that night and was going toward the northwest.
Meaning it was originating from the southeast?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Heading toward the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State.
I mean, I think that's really largely a function of where the jet is at the time.
There's no documentation on that. Meteorological reports say from the southwest.
Go to the port of Portland and just basically take off if we wanted to. If it was there in that area, think about it. If he landed somewhere near Tina's Bar, St. John's, he'd be able to get to the port of Portland. He'd be able to get another ticket to get the hell out of Dodge.
Well,
It's a logical thing. The FBI is basically distracting us by going to Ariel. Because it was one of them. It was one of them.
Yeah, it's a possibility.
I just wanted to add a fact. The most fascinating fun I've had with this is back in the day, the meteorology reports came on a house that sat on the West Hills. So PDX now reports the weather, but back in that day, it was a house in the West Hills. So when I went over there, a lady just happens to live and own that house as a Delta airline flight attendant, and she was willing to say, oh yeah, this was a meteorology house before whoever owned it, before I owned it, whatever. So there are reports out there about the exact winds from not the airport, but the West Hills, where at that day I don't even know if it was NOAA or whatever, was giving reports. So it's fascinating that even the people living in that house today are airline connected. So woo!
Boy, this is sounding vortexy, isn't it? All kinds of conflicting information already here. So any other questions out? Yes, yes, sir.
So obviously the law enforcement knew pretty early on what was happening with the hijacking, and they knew that they were flying south. I was wondering if you have any information as to what kind of law enforcement buildup happens at this kind of time. I mean, were they just tracking the plane and just hoping that they had enough people in the area to immediately go there, or was there any kind of, because you said like thousands of National Guard troops were mobilized, like what was the buildup like as the plane was in the air going southbound?
Well, and I'll let other people answer, but my understanding is, and again, there's some conflicting information on this, but my understanding is that they were actually surprised that he jumped. The expectation was on the part of law enforcement, and perhaps somebody could say something otherwise, that he was going to at least arrive in Reno for the refueling stop and then continue on to ultimately Mexico City. So by him jumping shortly after taking off, it really caught them off guard. So I'll pass that down. I don't know who else wants to comment.
Yeah, here's what I know. There was very little done. One of the reasons is no one in the FBI thought he was actually going to jump. There were no roadblocks. There was no scrutiny of law enforcement. Reports had gone out looking for a guy walking down the street wearing a wet clothes, okay, with a bag that should have a lot of money in it, and he may be carrying a parachute. So there was a general report that had gone out to the guys who were working, the cruisers on the Highway Patrol and Washington State Patrol and Clark County and Cowlitz County Sheriff's Departments. Other than a radio report, there was nothing for the Republic. Don't pick up any hitchhikers on the I-5. The first scrutiny of D.B. Cooper, the first look for D.B. Cooper was conducted by Ralph Himmelsbach, who hopped in his airplane Thursday, Thanksgiving morning at 9 o'clock, took off from Aurora State Airport and went flying over Ariel and Amboy, because that was the preliminary suggestion from Northwest Orient that would be the landing zone, that he probably jumped out at Battleground and probably landed somewhere up towards Ariel or Amboy. So a plane flew over, and that was the initial, and so a lot of helicopters started taking off, and that was the next expectation. If he jumped, since they knew by then they knew he wasn't on the plane in Reno, so it's like, let's go look for a parachute. They figured he had got hung up in a tree, and he's gonna be easy pickings. And they were shocked not to see any parachutes. So then it's like, oh my God, we gotta send guys, we gotta get boots on the ground. The first boots on the ground went into the woods Friday afternoon after lunch. Cooper had a 40-hour head start before anybody was in the woods looking for him. And the guys looking for him was a grand total of 20 guys. A crew organized by the Clark County Sheriff's Department, who started calling up brother-in-law and friends and the next door neighbors to see if they could get volunteers, and they got the volunteer fire department to come out and join them. And they looked on Cedar Creek Road was the first place, and they looked for about a square mile for a couple days, tromping around, didn't find a thing. The 1,000 troopers that came, it was not quite 1,000, it was over 200 active duty soldiers came down from Fort Lewis in March of 1972. They were 5 months late to the party. And they're right, they didn't find D.B. Cooper, but they found 2 dead women, sexually molested. And they got snowed out as they went into the higher elevations. Went back to Fort Lewis, came back 2 weeks later and finished up another 2 weeks in the Amboy area. And that was the total ground search. And that's what I know of the initial hunt for D.B. Cooper.
Yes,
This
Darren.
question's for all of you. Do you believe the bomb was real?
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the question first, and then I'm going to pass the microphone down And I think what I've decided to do as far as the drawing is concerned, because we've got a few different books and so forth, I have a wonderful deck of cards over there, which I know is complete, means it has 52 decks of cards. I'm going to hand everybody a card out of that deck, and then we'll just say Ace of Clubs or something, and whoever happens to have that will win the first prize and so forth. So that we'll each have.
For my book, I will mentally select a card.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll do it that way, where each one of us will kind of just pick a random card, the 3 of Hearts or something, if somebody happens to have that. So,
We'll be quantum entangled. Okay.
so I'm going to do that while they're answering. So you guys are going to have to filibuster if it's taking me too long to get it all out there.
Not to worry. We have
Yeah, but I'll say, to answer your question, no, I don't think the bomb is real. If the bomb was real, I just can't see him jumping with it. That doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. And that's really pretty much it. I do think it's very notable that he really went out of his way to take everything with him out of the jet. The book of matches that were depleted while he was smoking cigarettes, he didn't want that thrown away in the trash. He took that back from the flight attendant. The original note that he wrote that he handed off saying, "I've got a bomb," he took that back, obviously. The original note that the flight attendant wrote with his request and was brought to the captain, he also brought that back, took the bomb, took everything else. The only thing that obviously he left behind, and I think it was accidentally, was the tie and the tie clip. So to answer your question, no, I do not think that the bomb was real.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it was real either. And Walter stated in the audio tapes that he used road flares. They were red, they looked a lot like it, and cut the nails off at the end, and then just jury-rigged the rest of it. So, yeah, there was no indication that it was real. And Walter also said he threw the training reserve chute. He threw that out. He was hoping when it hit that it would deploy and actually distract. He threw the bomb out, so he didn't do that around. But you're right, he was very diligent about not bringing anything or leaving anything. He actually went into detail about how he put quick drying glue on his fingers. He did it in the airport, in the restroom, and he did it again before he actually initiated. So, yeah, they were pretty careful.
Yeah, I concur that the bomb is very unlikely to be real, both from the color of the stickers, I think I mentioned in my talk, it being red, it's not the right color. And also we didn't find any particles on the tie that would relate to explosives. So pretty cut and dry, I think, there.
You guys don't think it was a bomb?
I'm going to say I think the bomb was real. More importantly, I think it was wise for the crew and the FBI to consider that the bomb was real. I think that was a very smart move. And there has been, I've heard some reports, reliable reports from people who handle dynamite that said, yeah, they know, they've seen red dynamite, red sticks of dynamite in that vintage era, 1970, 1971. I think the information that there's no residue of explosives on the tie is compelling, though.
Question back here?
A different question.
Okay, sure, let's keep going. Let's keep rolling.
A different question. So, right after the Vietnam era, I have a question on what you all know about possibly, with 132 prior hijackings in that time frame, and so many people confessing that they were possibly D.B. Cooper themselves confessing. Can y'all refresh my memory about what maybe in the Vietnam era could have been an operation that had like maybe potentially a code word that could have either created 132 hijackings potentially, or so many people psychologically wanting to confess to something like this? Do y'all have any information?
Oh, sure. You want to talk mind control, MK Ultra?
Oh,
Yeah, all right. Oh, sure. Okay. So all the skyjackings were concocted as part of a government program as kind of like, let's try out how good our MK Ultra program is. It's a possibility. One of the things that fuels conversations like this is how come guys like Walter Reca, and I've talked to Vern about this extensively, if Walter Reca is not D.B. Cooper, then what the hell was he doing in the woods, soaking to the skin, the night before Thanksgiving? What was he there for? Was he part of a very large D.B. Cooper skyjacking-esque program that had other kinds of agendas? And there are lots of other people who have confessed to being D.B. Cooper. Barb Dayton, utterly convinced she was D.B. Cooper. Compelling stories. The book about her has lots of details about how she did it that far surpass what Walter Recker is talking about. Dwayne Weber, on his deathbed, is confessing to being D.B. Cooper. Man, that's compelling too. So there's a lot of evidence, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, about MKUltra and what is coming to be known as the weaponization of consciousness, which is MKUltra is only part of. And the movie and the books called The Men Who Stare at Goats and things like that, and remote viewing, and all these other kinds of things that most people say woo-woo, it's new agey stuff, but it's very real because there's very real programs that are investigating this and trying to develop these skills. So perhaps we'll save that for the beer tonight at Victor 23 to continue that conversation. But
Either of your guys have any exposure to MKUltra and your theory of who it was?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Walter did have afterwards. He believed that was, he didn't use those terms, but after he was given an ultimatum to either go to prison or work for them, some of the scenes that he described were very similar. They were just really bizarre questions and placed in really unusual situations. But it was more, the part that he talked about was more about a training, you know, walking through a room and, okay, where would you hide, where would you escape, where would you, you know, those kind of things. But but he did call it mind sculpting was part of it. That was a phrase that he used. And so, and I think that obviously convincing someone to risk their life and go into a country and shoot someone you don't even know takes some sculpting or mind altering logic sometimes. So he didn't mention it anywhere before the hijacking, but he certainly did mention it beginning a couple of months afterwards, yes.
I got a question, Phil.
I just want to follow up on that. I just want to follow up. The process of, there's been a lot of research that's documented and is very real about the military trying to amplify biofeedback and mindfulness techniques. For instance, if you're shot, how do you prevent yourself from going into shock? How do you prevent yourself from bleeding out? How can you slow down your bleeding? Things like that. Very real things of mindfulness. In Vietnam, how do you desensitize your troopers to their fear? How do you amplify their ability, their taste for combat? How do you get guys to live in the woods on recon for weeks at a time, to function amped up on amphetamines so they never sleep and they don't get hungry? There are compelling pharmacological processes to get you a better trooper, a better soldier that's more effective, that's going to come back home. When he comes back home, he may have other issues, but we'll worry about that tomorrow. In the meantime, I want him out in the field killing Viet Cong and not getting shot himself. So those are the agendas and the pressure and the dynamics of all of this. And MKUltra is going on at the same time. You know, so these are all very real things, and it's just tantalizing. How does D.B. Cooper fit into all of this? Oh my God. Yeah. Bradley, you want to say something? Yeah.
Thanks. I'd like to ask each of you that have a suspect, you, and you. Mr. K, I'm sure you're out of this right now. I want to ask you a very simple question, just each of you. If you can answer it as we go down the line. What would the approximate height and weight be of your suspect on the night of the hijacking, roughly?
In the south.
Let's start with this gentleman.
Wasn't my turn.
You know,
Roughly,
it is your turn.
Go ahead.
height, weight.
Sheridan Peterson, 6'1", about 185 pounds.
Okay, well, that's good.
Walter Recker was 5'10", and he was about 170 pounds.
Okay, so approximately the same height. Your favorite suspect?
Yeah.
I'm trying to lose weight and get down to 190, that's all I know.
What I'll do is I'll ask one final question up here, and then after that, we've got a few items to give away, and this is where the cards will come into play. My final question is what happened to the money? You had obviously $10,000, $20 bills. Do you think it got washed out to sea? Do you think it got burned in a fire pit? Do you think it's sitting in a safety deposit box somewhere? Any theories with respect to that? And I'll start with you, Bruce, as to what happened to the money. And kind of along those lines, is it still out there where perhaps someday, somehow, somewhere, somebody finds some of it, and that opens up a whole new chapter in the D.B. Cooper saga?
If I had to put money on a bet, is there any money anywhere or there's no money anywhere? I would say there's money somewhere. And for me, the most compelling case is some of the kinds of things we've been talking about. Somebody that's militarized, somebody that has combat training, smoke jumping kind of training, those kinds of things, and lives in a exclusive kind of environment where people aren't asking him questions. Like if he lives on an army base and his friends know, hey, where were you last week? Oh, I did a job. Well, no one's going to ask him, yeah, what'd you do? No, he said, that's it, the code of silence. It's very pervasive in certain kinds of community. Not us, certainly not me, but other guys, yes.
Okay, I'll start by saying I think the money was spent. And I'll give you a scenario that I personally believe would explain some of the things. One of the advantages we have being 47 years down the road here is we can start saying some things. If Cooper's body was out there and the parachute was laying on the ground, I think by now we would have stumbled across him. The area that he jumped in is not the deep, dark death woods. People live there. There's logging going on, people walking through the woods. I think we would have found him by now. So if it's a safe bet we would have found his body by now and it's not there, that means he left. Also a safe bet, we would probably found the parachute by now, right, at this point in the game. So let me give you this. If you look at it from Cooper's perspective, he doesn't know that they knew when he jumped. His strategy was, I'm going to fly from here to Reno, and they're not going to have any idea where I jump between Seattle and Reno. I got plenty of time. So would it be possible that Cooper gathered up his parachute, gathered up his money, went near a road, put the stuff down on the side of the road, hitchhiked back to his car, wherever he was, and then came back and got the money and got the parachute and took off with both? Because remember, he was relaxed. He didn't think they had any clue where he was. So he would come back and clean up the whole thing the same way he cleaned it up into the cabin when he took back the matches and the notes. He potentially cleaned up the money and the parachute. And that means he got away scot-free and he spent the money. We've already heard from other testimony here that the random serial numbers really screwed everything up. Could have easily spent the money. And if it was from Canada, he could have spent it up in Canada and they never would have found it. So I think he had a great time with the money. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. As I mentioned in my presentation, Walter said he spent some of the money. And as long as it wasn't unusual for you to deposit, $80,000 or $100,000 at a time, you could spend the money, especially in an area where they routinely deposit cash deposits. The bankers weren't trained to do that. When we talked to the bankers, they thought it was ridiculous that the FBI would send a letter saying, we want you to check all these serial numbers. Because they're like, no, that's not what we do. We have other things that we do, and you can't tell us what to do. I thought we're the FDIC, they could, but not the FBI. Walter said he put it in a bank, and then he was taught how to launder it. So, and it was up in Canada. And so it was, I believe it was spent. I believe Walter, when he said that, yes, he definitely spent some of the money. But the rest, as I mentioned, he had some money when he died in Canada. So yes, we're very aware of that. So yeah, I believe he spent it and enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's really a tough question because, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways to play this, but Sheridan Peterson, he obviously, as mentioned earlier, became a suspect within days of the skyjacking, and the FBI went and interviewed his ex-wife in California. I know Sheridan was living overseas at the time, and at some point Sheridan obviously became aware of the fact that the FBI was looking into his background, was looking at him as a suspect. Now, either Sheridan Peterson was living in Nepal, knew nothing about this, and was shocked to find out that the FBI is looking into him as a suspect, or Sheridan Peterson was D.B. Cooper, probably thinking he got away with it, and then realizes, holy cow, how did they put the pieces together so quickly? They're interviewing Claire in Bakersfield, California. There are some other things with Sheridan's timetable too that caused me to believe that when Sheridan found out that he was a suspect, and he did find out, he obviously found that at some point, even though I've been unable to determine when that was, I actually think he would have shut down. I think he would have abandoned any unspent money, which is most of it. But I also know Sheridan is putting it kindly, a rat pack. This guy has a very difficult time throwing anything away, papers or anything away. So I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in his safety deposit box or a box in his closet somewhere that there is some money left over. Assuming, of course, Sheridan Peterson was D.B. Cooper. So, are there any final questions before we? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I don't know much, but I'm asking, was the head of the FBI at that time Hoover, and he kept tabs on a lot of people, and like as a, I don't know, a control list? And is there a possibility that if this guy was a military operative, that for some reason from the top down from Hoover, then because of the military background, they wouldn't want to expose who it really was for some governmental reason? Could you all go into that maybe a little bit?
It was really not much more complicated than he schemes up the idea. He obviously has some experience parachuting and so forth. He jumps out of the plane and gets away. And I don't think it was really much more complicated than that. I'm not really buying the black op kind of thing and all that other kind of thing. I appreciate the fact that others have different feelings about it. So whether Hoover was the director of the FBI, and there was a period of time where there was just an acting director after Hoover was no longer there, so they kind of lacked any kind of leadership there. But I don't think that really made any kind of difference ultimately as far as D.B. Cooper was concerned.
Yeah, I don't know who it was that directed the diversion, but I believe it was directed, as I mentioned, for the greater good. That was Hoover's last days. He died, I believe, in May of '72. Is that? I think that's accurate.
Sometime in '72.
Yeah, but it was a really tumultuous time for the FBI at that point. They had some people had broken into anti-war activists had broken into their files in Pennsylvania, and it had not all, but a lot of Hoover's information about who he was blackmailing in the Senate, and it was all the Congress. It was crazy. So that was a really tumultuous time. In addition to that, the FBI was dealing with, like I said, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement. There were still some protests and sometimes riots every weekend. They kind of had their hands full, It was a really, really strange time for them. So I don't discount that it was Hoover, but I don't know. I think it was actually the intelligence community itself that made the diversion, and probably irritating Hoover, actually.
So I'm going to go with the vanilla version of the Cooper story. I think if he was a hardened criminal, usually these guys get caught down the road. We don't think that happened to Cooper. I can imagine, again, I'm speculating here, being the science guy, I get to speculate on the side, that Cooper was some probably Joe average guy that got into trouble to the tune of about 200 grand. And somebody probably pointed a gun at his head and said, listen, buddy, you don't give me the 200 grand by tomorrow, I'm gonna blow your face off, right? So here's this Joe average guy who's got to cook up something. He was a pretty smart guy. He had some information. I think it was a desperation move on his part. I think that he got away with the cash, potentially paid off the problem or got rid of the problem with the money, and he went back to his normal life. And that's why we haven't caught the guy, because he he popped up and did something crazy and went back to normalcy and said, never again am I ever going to do anything like that. So it's all speculation on my part, but I can imagine that happening more than I can imagine he's part of some government conspiracy where lots of things, lots of knobs are being turned.
That is vanilla.
That's vanilla.
Yeah. It's all possible, you know, a phone call. Hey, Jay, you got to shut your boys down. Who knows?
2019 version of the conference.
By 2021, we'll have a better answer for that. We'll keep working on it. Yeah. To be continued.
Again, I wanted to thank my speakers and guests for coming out here. I know it was an effort and it was on their own dime, so I mean, it wasn't like I was paying for plane tickets or anything here other than my own. So I appreciate you taking the time and traveling down here and the expense and so forth that you incurred doing that. There's a lot of valuable information that I think was that made this conference great. So I'd like to applaud you for that, everybody. I would also like to thank you folks for being here. I really wasn't sure what to expect in terms of a turnout. I think overall I counted somewhere around 85 people or so throughout the course of the day, which I think is a respectable showing. The plan is to do this every year, so sometime around the same point in 2019, we'll plan on doing the same thing. And you know, I guess I should have probably collected some email addresses from some people, but having said that, if you're interested in being kept in the loop with any future conferences, specifically a year from now, please visit the site, the dbcoopercon.com website, and there's a link at the very bottom where you can sign up and supply your email address. We'll keep you at the link. So having said all that, thank you very much, folks. Appreciate you coming out, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you.